The prime minister before this one in Norway said after he won his second round election, said, well, now this is 2 elections in a row that we won by promising not to lower taxes. Why do the Nordic people want to pay high taxes? A, they trust their government will use them effectively, efficiently, and well. And number 2, they know what my father told me when I was a boy. You get what you pay for. So happy to be here tonight. As Chuck said, I've known him for a long time. I've admired him for a long time. What a career, what a contribution he's made. And so it felt to me like a real honor that he would share this forum with me. And here I am for the first time. I'm not here for the first, I'm not in the Unitarian Universalist Church for the first time because I've given sermons on Sunday mornings, but I haven't done this. And this I'm so looking forward to, because this book is a product of so much love and persistence over many, many years. In fact, some people who have noticed, George, when you do these book talks about your book, you're so high energy, you're so, and it's true, and it's because you're looking at a pent-up man. I'm pent up because when I was 21 years old, I married a Norwegian in Norway. I'd fallen in love with her 2 years before in this country. She was a foreign student here, but she went off to Norway without marrying me. And the condition of our getting married was that I had to go there and marry her, which of course I wanted to do because I wanted to know her family and her culture and her language and all of that. And on the other hand, I wasn't exactly sure when I met her just where Norway was, so it would also be a way of learning some geography because once there I would probably understand where Norway was. Anyway, what I got to do was study there at the University of Oslo, and that's where I started my sociological studies. And also, I got to teach school in a secondary school and practice my new Norwegian, which was fractured Norwegian, and the students loved every mistake I made and practically fell on the floor every time, which was frequently. So I was the comedian in the school because I kept mispronouncing Norwegian words or using bad grammar. And then, and also they would say, try this word, teacher, and they would say a word and I would try, but of course it would be an obscene word, and then they would all completely riot. So we had a grand time in the secondary school where I taught, and also just falling in love with her family and her culture was deeply meaningful to me. We did decide to come back and plant ourselves in the US. Her family was appalled, as you can imagine. The US not having a good reputation in Norway. Assassinating presidents doesn't strike most Norwegians as a great way to proceed. And we need a little more volume. Okay.
Well, just lean in a little.
Lean in a little. I've heard that phrase, lean in. Okay, so there we go with the possibility of staying there with a great job and a very, very reduced stress life. But we thought, hey, the country that really needs us is the United States. And I was brought up to be a very patriotic boy, and I thought, come on, back to the US, let's see what we could do. So as I plunged into the civil rights movement and other movements back here, I kept telling people what I had learned about how they did things in Norway. And also in Sweden and Denmark, because I got to work there at various points. And each time I would bring stories back, what the response would be from my friends and acquaintances would be a roll of the eyes. Why are you bothering us with these stories from this exotic country? Because, after all, if it was a really good thing that's done, we would be doing it. Because the United States of America is, as we all know, the greatest country in the world. And so, you know, why talk about any place else? So that happened decade after decade after decade because I kept running back there and, of course, the other Scandinavian countries and coming back here then with more stories, right? And always the same response. This is the greatest country, don't bother. 2008. Anybody here remember 2008? some uncertainty struck my countrymen and women, and think of this. We're racing for the cliff. We're about to go into a Great Depression again. And for the first time, I met people who got humble. So, well, maybe there is something we could learn from another way of doing things. So tell us more, George. I thought, this is the time for a book. And so I happened to be teaching by then at Swarthmore College, and the college backed me up and supported me to be able to run back and forth to interview leading economists in those countries and political scientists and politicians and people of various walks of life. So that was a delightful 7 years. So now you will understand why I'm pent up. I'm pent up because for something like 50 years, I've been wanting to tell you what's going on over there, and you didn't want to listen. And now people want to listen. And I'm just grateful also in a personal way to you for showing up here tonight, indicating that you want to listen and that you're humble about the possibility that maybe the United States has at least one or two things we could learn from another country. Well, this evening will actually be short on lecture and long on question and answer and dialogue, because a lot of you do have impressions, a lot of you do have questions and challenges about how the U.S. could actually use some of those practices that are going on over there. And I want to honor your questions and honor your challenges, and therefore I want most of the evening to be your questions and challenges and comments and my responses, so that I'll be meeting you where you are. But it may be that there's another story or two I could tell just to show you that as a sociologist, not an economist, but somebody very interested in the impact of economics on the way people live, I got to learn some characteristic things about those countries in a very human way. So I'll tell a story, for example, about my first day at the University of Oslo, when I plunked down my $14 matriculation fee and waited for the other shoe to drop. Surely there's something else. I mean, I'd heard that it was free, but surely, nothing's free. Come on. And so I waited, and that really was it. And I felt like total stranger in a strange land. And I turned to a couple of the new friends I was making, Norwegian students, and I said, please help me understand this. How does it make any sense for a country to give free higher education to its people? How does that make any pragmatic sense? And so a guy named Sigurd said, look, George, wouldn't you say that brain power is an economic resource for a country? Well, yes, I said, surely brain power is an economic resource. Well, said Sigurd, then why would you want to repress the potential brain power of a country by attaching a price tag to its development? Why wouldn't you want the fullest possible development of brain power in order to bring about the fullest possible development of the economy? Whoa, that's deep, I thought. And on my way back to the apartment that I was sharing with Barrett, I gave that a long thought. Because up until then, the features of the Nordic economic model that I had heard about all sounded almost suspiciously good-hearted. You know what I mean? Idealistic. Like free education and getting rid of poverty and stuff like that. That all just sounds like, I don't know, Christian morality run wild or something. What sense does all this make? And I realized on the way home, as I was really thinking about it, how pragmatically sound that principle was, at the same time as it was a principle that supported equality, because of course equality to all who have the capacity to be able to go into higher education and go through medical school and law school and ballet school and so on and so on and so on. And now that Norway has a little more money because of the oil find, if a student, say, at the University of Oslo says, I'm now clear. I want a PhD in Mandarin literature. And nobody in Norway can teach me this. The government says, well, but Harvard has a good program, we'll send you there. So it's an enormous commitment to individuals in the country to get as far as they can go. Let's say the medical school admissions are full and no more can be accepted, but there are few people who are aspiring doctors anyway. Where do you want to go? Denmark, we'll send you to Denmark. Where do you want to go? Swedish medical school, we'll send you there. You have to agree that you come back here to practice medicine, but if you're willing to make that agreement, we'll send you off to do that, and of course we'll foot the bill. So it's that enormous commitment that makes it then not surprising that the economies of all four of those countries are highly robust, and they have an over 60-year track record of shared prosperity. To the point where worker productivity is higher there than here. Like one of the things that I had heard among rumors about Nordic countries was, well, they're addicted to welfare, and welfare is a bad thing because it means that people won't work and they get lazy and stuff like that. Well, if those are lazy peoples, then why do they have higher worker productivity than we do? And it turns out that there was a theoretical basis for this. There was an economist, a Swedish economist, named Gunnar Myrdal, whose name some of you would know, perhaps because he also did a study in the United States of race relations, called The American Dilemma. It was one of the great early studies of that. But before he did that, he made his reputation as an economist. And his economic PhD was developing a new theory on what it is that gets people to work, which is an ongoing question for any country, right? Like, what is it that gets people to work and be maximally productive? And he argued that it's not the threat of suffering, the threat of pain, the threat of punishment if you don't work, that gets people to maximize their productivity. What actually works is to create jobs that people want to do, design the job in such a way that people are supported to do it, and to support people into those jobs through training and education that enables them to be good at it, and to have a labor market situation such that people aren't stuck as a square peg in a round hole doing a job that doesn't suit them, but instead are supported to find the job that makes sense for them, that unleashes them, that enables them to wake up wanting to go to work. And it's that kind of design, a key word in understanding what works over there. It's creating that kind of design that then supports people to a level of productivity that the United States cannot reach. So I thought, whoa, that was Gunnar Myrdal back in the 20s. He got a Nobel Economics Prize for that. And all four of the countries that I study in my book, Iceland, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, proceed on that principle that human beings, that it's natural for human beings to want to work. In that way, they agreed with Sigmund Freud. That was one of the, you may remember, he said the two things that enable human happiness are the ability to work and the ability to love. Fundamental to human nature. And Myrdal was saying, so what makes all this possible is a question susceptible to design. So let's get down to designing things so that they actually work. So anyway, that was one of the most profound things that influenced me as I was learning more and more, interviewing more and more, studying more and more. I realized that a number of the designs that they've set up have been designs that, yes, do support equality, so that those countries are indeed more equal than we are. And yes, they do support individual freedom, so that, for example, Swedes are freer than we are, Danes are freer than we are, Icelanders are freer than we are as individuals. So yes, they care about values, they care about the same values we do. We usually care about individual freedom, right? And equality and community. They have the same values we have. But what they believe is that with a design head on the question, then you can come up with designs that support your values and also support the stability and success of the economy, and that these things are not at war with each other. What a realization. I mean, philosophically, what if that were extended to be in general the case? What if those of us who are prone to discover terrible dilemmas, I could do the right thing or I could do the practical thing, and which shall I do? What if it turned out that those ways we're tearing ourselves apart are actually human constructions, and that the way reality has actually been constructed is one world rather than two, not a world of morality and a world of pragmatism, but instead one world in which morality and pragmatism meet and reinforce each other. And the degree of success, and those societies are not utopias. Norwegians will be the first to tell you, we are a nation of complainers. and I will say that based especially on my family-in-laws, yes, they are a nation of complainers. So we're not talking about utopia over here, but we're talking about, you know what we're talking about? We're talking about what was a phrase that was very current for Americans when I was a boy. When I was in high school, one of the big themes of American culture was, we are a can-do society. Anybody ever hear that in your life? Maybe just older people, or yeah, some younger people too have heard that. We are a can-do society. That was, I never hear that anymore, by the way. How about that? But that used to be the way we looked at things. And I believe that if we know that there are can-do societies that have made the most of their resources through a number of design innovations, maybe we also could take that attitude again. Maybe that's the kind of America we need to return to. The America that believed it could solve its problems and could innovate and create designs that work. And that's what I believe. So that's why I've been holding back all these years, and now I'm ready for questions. I'll try my best to respond. Yes? Well, technically it's called democratic socialism. Yes, yes. In a country where even President Obama gets called a socialist, I suppose there it would be like rabid, out of control communism or something. But actually, the correct term would be democratic socialism. Such a great question. One of my questions also, one of my big research questions as I was doing this work. So picture me, there I am in Oslo, the capital city of Norway, about to interview the two senior researchers of a social science think tank. And on my way into the conference room where we're going to sit at a table and I'm going to ask all these questions, there is a photograph on the wall, several photographs. One of the photographs shows an obviously, or at least it looked to me like a Chinese delegation of people all standing for this photo op with these two researchers I was about to interview. And I look at this and I look at them and I say, are those Chinese? And they said, yes, they were sent by the People's Republic of China. They were policy experts and economists and so on. They were sent here to learn about our model. And I said, well, how could they think that they could learn anything? Because China makes the United States look little. And China's degree of heterogeneity is much greater than ours, right? I mean, at least most of us do speak the same language. In China, they're a long way from that, right? I mean, they can't even swallow Tibet, which is what they would like to do. They have enormous cultural differences within China, and they're an enormous, enormous country. And the People's Republic of China sends experts to tiny Norway to learn something. So I said, how did that make any sense? And the researchers, these Norwegian researchers said, well, that's exactly the question we asked them as soon as we sat down. We said, what on earth are you doing here? So you've asked a great question. I mean, this is bound to be on your mind, right? So this is what the Chinese said. The Chinese said, look, There are some economic issues and economic policies and structures that are very influenced by scale. And there are innovations that can't simply be scaled up. However, said they, there are other economic policies and structures that can be scaled up. And so we will be especially asking you about kinds of things that can, in our judgment, be scaled up to China's size, or possibly be scaled up to provincial level size to be done on a provincial level in China. So a number of things immediately occurred to me, like, well, we have states, so there might be things that don't work on a national, but could work on a state scale, right? Analogous to the Chinese. And I also got to think, well, okay, now what are some of the features that we have? We have Social Security. Now, Social Security works for 330 million people, but it works really well in Iceland for 320,000 people. That's quite a scaling up. And we borrowed Social Security from smaller societies in Europe in the first place and decided we'll just scale it up, see what happens. We scaled it up, and what would we do without Social Security? Now, our Social Security is inadequate, terribly inadequate. But that's not because of the system, that's because the right wing won't allow it to be funded properly so that elders are supported properly. So the difference in the Nordic model for senior support and ours, I mean, the reason why on the rating charts, you may know, some of you, that there are ratings for almost everything now, international ratings, even a happiness index, right? So one of the ratings is, where is it best to be an elder? The best place to be an elder is in the Nordic countries. Why? They have a Social Security system like we do, but they load it with money so that elders retire in dignity. And we load it in a very stingy way so that it's not really enough for our elders. But without it, some people would literally starve. So Social Security would be an example. Another example would be Medicare. Medicare, of course, Bernie Sanders says Medicare for all. That's what we need, right? Okay, but we only have Medicare for a slice of Americans. Now, Medicare is rated by Americans, American consumers, more highly than private healthcare insurance is. In other words, Medicare is definitely a credible system nationwide for us. But it used to be a controversial idea, just an idea. And there were definitely questions, could this work? So I've now changed from skeptical, you know, like, well, it probably wouldn't work, to let's look at each feature. I mean, free higher education. New Yorkers used to have free higher education. Free higher education in New York City for many, many years. California used to have free higher education.
I went to City College.
You went, stand up, a proud product of free higher education.
I was a little girl in the 1950s in New York City, and my parents never told me girls don't do that, but a lot of girls were told, you know, you don't do stuff. I not only went to City College, but then I was able to go, I was helping support my parents, who were older parents. They had to wait till after World War II to have kids. My mom actually was in her 40s already when I was born. I almost didn't get here.
We can't go into the whole story, but what you're capping up is what?
So the thing was, when I was 22, I went to work, helped support my parents, but I was able to go to graduate school because there was a lot of government funding for graduate school.
All right, thank you.
Right.
Thank you. So let me summarize it for the others, because I couldn't hear you. So she was in a situation where her parents could not only that they couldn't afford to send you, but they actually couldn't afford to manage themselves. And so you had to support them while going to City College for free, and then going to graduate school for free because of government.
When I was in college, but later, after I graduated college.
Okay, so later on after college, right, went on to graduate school for free. Right. So we need to find out from our elders what we used to take for granted, but has been, friends, taken from us. And what a cruel irony. And then to say, oh, those countries that have it, well, that wouldn't work here. Wouldn't work here, right? So I'm now turning it around. Instead of making the supposition that we can't make those things work, I make the assumption that we can, but there might be exceptions. However, in my book, in the last chapter, which is the longest chapter and is all about these questions of how can we adapt stuff there to here, I do say over and over that there shouldn't be like take a blueprint of that and try to impose it here. But we should really be thoughtful about what are the things there that might work, and then we need to do the design work to make sure it would work here on a national level, or work here on a state level, or work here on a regional level, or whatever that might be. Yes, question. What's different in the Nordic, what happened in the Nordic countries you've already anticipated, which is that they actually ran to the goal line. And what they did was they built, first, as Chuck mentioned, they did have this situation that we have of a kind of pretend democracy in which there was a parliament in each of the 4 countries and free elections. We have kind of, although now their free elections are getting shaky again. Nevertheless, somewhat free elections. They had that 100 years ago, and yet somehow, no matter what the majority of people wanted, the economic elite always got its way. Sound familiar? Yeah. So, very similar political situation to ours. And furthermore, they had some degree of civil liberties so that people could believe, well, we at least have some freedom of speech and so on and so on. But if things got too challenging to the prevailing order, then people could be thrown into jail, that kind of thing. So again, somewhat similar to here, right? Okay, so what happened was they built, the people saw through the pretense of democracy. That was number one. And I sense you do right now. So they saw through the pretense and they said, okay, so we need to mobilize a mass movement that will throw out the economic elite, which is always getting its way through fiddling the existing political system. And so that's what they did. They organized a mass movement. I can go into more detail later if you want about how they organized that mass movement, but they organized a movement that represented the majority of people, and then they made, the clearest examples are Norway and Sweden. In both of those countries, they made their countries ungovernable by the economic elite. Massive strikes, people in the streets, boycotts. When farms would be foreclosed, they would gang up and prevent auction from happening. As there was a little bit of experiment for us in 2009, right, in 2010, trying to prevent the foreclosure of mortgages and throwing out of families. That kind of thing was going on. So it was a mass movement that used very militant, nonviolent tactics in order to prevent the status quo from continuing. And in both Norway and Sweden, the governments had to, in fact, in Sweden it was very dramatic. The government actually fell and just, and scurried away. And it was the left wing representing the majority that took over. But the same thing happened, an equivalent thing happened in 1936 in Norway. So in other words, the majority of people, instead of being frustrated by this football game that never went anywhere, actually went ahead and went to the goal line and scored a touchdown. So they pushed what we call, I guess, the 1%. They pushed the economic elite out of dominance of the society. So it couldn't be running things anymore. And the majority then was put in the saddle. And so the majority, which was represented in parliament by, parties, went ahead and invented the Nordic model. And so societies that 100 years ago were like us in that they had terrible poverty. I mean, why did so many Norwegians and Swedes come to this country? They were fleeing desperate poverty and lack of opportunity, right? Danes did, Icelanders did. So what happened was the Nordic model came out of that struggle, massive national struggle, and the result was the 1% was fired, basically. The 1% had been the leaders of the society. It was basically, hey, you're doing a terrible job, we've noticed, you're fired. And we're taking over. And we are creating democracy. And then once we have democracy, then we can create the Nordic model that will work for the common good. And then they could put all these things in place that now, on these international charts that I told you about, put them in the top tier of those. So the countries that I studied play musical chairs at the top tier. You know, this year, oh, it's Norway that's number one, you know, best place to be an elder. But next year, it'll be Sweden that's number one, the best year and the best place to be an elder, and so on and so on. Yes? You will so love the last chapter of this book because it does go into this quite a bit. So I'll just mention a couple of things. One is that you mentioned that for one thing, we now have enormous division. We have a great polarization going on. Actually, they also had an enormous polarization going on. And it does seem to me, as a sociologist, that polarization offers the opportunity for going to the goal line. When I think about the 30s, for example, that was a period of enormous polarization. There was a Nazi movement in the United States. There was a communist movement in the United States. Those were, I suppose, the extremes. The Ku Klux Klan was flourishing. You know, it was pretty much you name it, we had it. We didn't have Maoists yet, but we had a great enormous division in our country. We had members of the economic elite who thought Franklin Roosevelt was crazy, even though he was one of them, and so on. So it was a very crazy decade. It was also a decade of enormous progress in the United States. Many of the things that we depend on now, for example, Social Security, happened during that decade. Then things quieted down in the 40s and 50s, not much happened. The 60s, polarization. Polarization, this time not led by economic factors, but by a race of people standing up for themselves and saying freedom is the requirement, the new requirement for our country. And during the civil rights period, NRA membership went up, right? Ku Klux Klan got more active, right? There was increasing polarization, and a lot of viciousness happened. And the 60s was a decade of enormous steps forward. In fact, it continued into the 70s. Enormous steps forward in our society. That's when Medicare happened, and the reality of environment happened, and the EPA was formed, just all kinds of good things. Nuclear power plants were stopped in that period, not to mention all the race-related steps forward that were taken at that time, which in the 50s, when I was coming of political age, I thought, oh, we'll never get to a place where discrimination becomes against the law. I just thought, you know, this is kind of embedded in American society. So polarization works for society to make great change. In fact, I think great change cannot be made without polarization. However, it has to be understood to be an opportunity. 2008, forward to 2008. In 2008, another polarization happened. This was economic driven in that particular case, right? Tremendous uproar about Wall Street. Do you remember that? Tremendous uproar. The first stimulus bill couldn't get passed because there was such fury toward Wall Street. Now, I mean, some people would take the point of view, Wall Street deserved every bit of fury it could get. But that was not an organized anger. It was not an anger organized by the left. I talked with a Democratic Party, not the Democratic Party is left exactly, but it's a somewhat center-left. I talked, am I too?
Still just need to lean in a little more.
Lean in more?
People in the way back, yeah.
Oh, in the way back?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, and please, people in the back, do come forward if you can, because I love to be able to see in the whites of people's eyes when possible, so do come forward. Anyway, what was I talking about? The 2008, yes. What an opportunity for the Democrats, right? Anti-Wall Street, right? So I talked with a Democratic Party insider who was active in the party at that time. I said, okay, so you're inside the Beltway, you know everything that's going on. I want to ask, within the Democratic Party, I want to ask you, did you hear any discussion in Democratic Party circles about the possibilities of reaching out to the small towns and the suburbs and the cities where people were outraged with Wall Street. It struck him as a question out of the ether. Wow. And he thought about it. He said, that never occurred to me. No, I never heard anybody talking about that. Do you know who did organize? The Tea Party. The Tea Party organized the anti-Wall Street anger in 2008, 9, and 10. And polls on a variety of social issues, when it comes to Wall Street, when a poll includes that kind of set of questions about Wall Street and asks Tea Party people, they still get enormous anger from rank and file Tea Party members who hate Wall Street. We cannot understand the Trump phenomenon until we understand this. That the centrist leftish liberal Democratic Party was so out of step with economic reality in our country and so determined to march in sync with Wall Street that it could not even think of organizing anger against Wall Street for the incredible irresponsibility of Wall Street that set up the Great Recession, from which we have still not fully recovered.
What about Occupy, though? Does that constitute?
Well, let me just draw a conclusion. Well, of course, Occupy, but that was grassroots. That wasn't Democratic Party organizing. That was grassroots. And it was late. But it finally happened. Thank goodness there was Occupy. Yeah, but that was very late. In other words, a party that's been supported by the labor movement for how many decades? A party that grew to be a majority party because of the labor movement in the 30s and 40s. Isn't that right? That very party decides to line up with Wall Street at 2008, 9, and 10 and allow the Republicans, out of sheer baloney, to, right? Because the Republicans are not anti-Wall Street, but they went ahead and organized those folks anyway because they saw that anger. So that's very situational. In other words, it's not structural. It's not a difference between us and the Nordics. It's just that the Nordic parties that cared about equality, let's put it that way, the parties that cared about equality and were not on the side of the economic elite saw an opportunity when it was there, which was the Depression. We will have another depression, right? Because ever since 2008, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the various outfits have been lobbying like crazy to prevent regulations that would curb the possibility of another Great Recession, if not something worse. They did very well out of the last Great Recession. The 1% made enormous amounts of money. The largest part, Chuck Collins, puts the statistics out frequently about how the greatest recovery actually happened in the top percent, not for the rest of us. And so I would say, instead of expecting the Democratic Party to do something that it has no recent track record to do, we need to do what the Nordics did back in the 20s and 30s, which is to organize a grassroots movement. And then take advantage of the polarization and the economic turbulence and the climate crisis caused turbulence in order to build a massive enough movement to make that change. So I would say situationally, we're coming into a situation that could be our opportunity, but only if we give up the notion that the Democrats will save us when they have absolutely no interest in doing that, because they are owned lock, stock, and barrel by Wall Street and the 1%. So that's what I would say. But wow, this is going in such a different direction. Lots of hands. Oh, wow. So let's go to the very back since we're having back trouble. Yes. There is a contrast between the strength of the labor movements of the Nordic countries and their alliance with parties that could take advantage of those opportunities, that was a strong situation for them. It's a weak situation for us now, and various reasons for that, right? And various reasons for why it was even weak for us in the 30s, right? And you include, as one of the reasons for that, the difference between the communists and this democratic socialists. Well, I grant you all of that. I completely agree with your analysis. I would also say that fast forward to now, we don't have a big struggle between the U.S. communist movement and the Democratic. So one reason why I'm putting so much energy into this book is it offers a practical and plausible vision. I mean, that struggle between socialists and communists, which was, I thought, very meaningful. I got involved in the 60s and, right, yeah. And I've worked in the labor movement. So I understand, and those were contrasting visions, right? Do you want a dictatorship of the proletariat and all that, as the communists wanted, or do you put democracy as the first word in what you want, and so on? And that was a very meaningful clash of visions. But that fight is mostly disappeared. And what's left stand, what I'm proposing that we do instead is say, let's create a vision of something plausible that has a 60-year track record of success, 60 years plus, and go to everybody, including labor, and say, would you like to struggle for this? And I would guess 19 out of 20 people, if convinced of the questions that you're raising about plausibility and so on, but if they became convinced that we could create whatever, we don't have to call it a social democratic model, we could call it whatever, America First model, I don't care what we call it, but if it had that character, this egalitarian and freedom-loving character, I think we could easily get a majority of people on board. And partly because, I mean, the sad thing in a way is that our culture is somewhat vision averse. Maybe it's exhausted with the fights over vision. But we might as well use that as an opportunity and say, okay, then let's lift up a vision that's a common sense vision that makes sense. So in the last chapter of this book, I cite poll after poll after poll after poll in which people say, majorities of people say, yes, of course, Medicare for all. They say, yes, free higher education is a great idea. They say, yes, we should pay more in taxes if it will deliver better public education, and so on and so on. My last chapter, the citation of polls in the last chapter so contradicts people's common understanding of what the majority of American people want. The majority of American people want what Bernie Sanders was offering, actually. And he was an unknown to most of the country. He was, right, there were all kinds of reasons why the majority couldn't actually incarnate its support. But he got tremendous working class support, right? Tremendous working class support. And he got tremendous young people's support whose minds weren't too cluttered with yesterday's political wars and could actually listen to what he said and say to themselves, well, that makes sense. That's the kind of future I want. So that's part of the purpose of my book, actually, is to offer a vision that my guess is everyone here would be able to take to their family. I tried it with my right-wing Republican brother. And I avoided all ideological language. He likes Trump. I avoided all ideological language. And I said, funny thing, Bob, what I found was that in Norway, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And he said, wow, that's interesting. And how your grandchildren who who struggle with disability, how they would be addressed in Sweden would be da-da-da-da-da-da. Oh, he said, well, that sounds good. And this and that and this and that. What do you think? He said, gee, it sounds like a plan. But I had to extract ideologically laden baggage from my description, right? And just get down to common sense. And so you'll find in the book that I tried to write in that way to support you, in case you wanted to take that up. And you fairly ask the question, why would we therefore want to try a model which requires trust in government and high taxes in order to work? I have an entire chapter on taxes, actually. They pay a lot of taxes, although it's mostly the rich who pay a lot of taxes. And so I include in the chapter on taxes interviews with people with many, many millions of dollars, in which the question is, why do you stay here in Norway and pay these incredibly high taxes, not only income taxes, but wealth taxes, because they are taxed additionally to income. There's a wealth tax every year that they pay. So why do you even stay here? You could go somewhere else and pay low taxes, and you'll be interested in the answers to those questions. Okay, so, but I think, let me actually respond to her question. Okay, she raised two interlinked questions: trust in government and taxes. So let me try to respond and see if it works. First of all, there's no really good reason why we should trust our government, because our government is run by the 1%, which does not have our interests at heart. So when somebody says, I don't trust our government, I say, well, I don't either, right? Now, 100 years ago, the Nordics did not trust their governments. They did not. Why? Because their governments were run by their economic elites, and there was no reason for them to trust their governments. So we're exactly like the Nordics in that way. We want to see a track record of performance in our interests before we will trust government, right? Okay. The second point about taxes is similar. That is, there's no reason why we should pay more taxes, I think, when the taxes, most of the taxes go to the military and CIA and NSA surveilling of us and all these things. So what if the taxes went to the things that benefit us? So there we can turn to the Nordic model and ask, okay, now how do people feel about their government? So 100 years ago, they didn't want to pay the high taxes. 100 years ago, they didn't trust their governments, deservedly so. Now, what's their situation? They trust their governments, and they're delighted to pay high taxes. The prime minister before this one in Norway said, after he won his second round election, said, well, now this is 2 elections in a row that we won by promising not to lower taxes. Why do the Nordic people want to pay high taxes? A, they trust their government will use them effectively, efficiently, and well. And number 2, they know what my father told me when I was a boy. You get what you pay for. When I was a young consumer, a 9-year-old consumer, and was attracted to a toy that was obviously going to smash in a day, and he'd say, you can spend your 35 cents on that toy, and it does seem so much cheaper than that $1.50 toy, but you get what you pay for. How many of you have ever heard that folk wisdom that used to be quite commonplace? I mean, you know it's true. Why do people pay what they pay for a BMW or a Mercedes? Because they're getting quality, or they believe they're getting very high quality that matches very high amounts of money. Americans are delighted to pay huge amounts of money for things if they get a huge amount of return. And so the question is then, how do we create a government that is worthy of our trust and that will use our taxpayers well, our taxes well? And we can only do that through a power shift that means our government and our taxes are not being decided upon, the use of, by the people who aren't interested in our interests, but instead are used for the things that we think are important. And that's why the poll data that I quote are so important, because it turns out that even in this highly corrupt political system that we have, there are still Americans, for example, in my state of Pennsylvania, who will say, look, we know our public education system is being defunded, it's going to hell, we want it to be funded properly, and we will pay more taxes if that will get it funded properly. We're consumers before we're citizens or before we're workers. We're consumers. So consuming is our number one duty. In fact, after 9/11, we were told by our president that the proper response to Al-Qaeda was for us to go to the mall and buy some more things. And I thought that was a very wonderful moment of revelation. Okay, so obviously, not only does there need to be a shift on the higher level of government and of economy, there needs to be a shift in us as well, in our people, because we've been through this terribly brutal conditioning process. And that's the purpose of social movements. That's why social movements arise. That's one of their functions. A progressive social movement doesn't just take people the way we were at the beginning of it and take us unchanged into the new society. No. Proper social movements, and I know a lot about that, that's my field and that's my practice, is helping social movements to be healthy and culturally rich, is to support people to regain their sense of agency. We're can-do people. Can do, not can consume, can buy, but can do, to recover our sense of agency, to recover our sense of solidarity, to recover our vision, and move forward as a mass movement. And then learn through that struggle, and some of you will remember the civil rights struggle or other struggles, in which people's lives were changed. Because in the very process of getting the new institutions, we ourselves change and become worthy of that vision. That's what happened for the Nordics. They are human species. They're not, we're not talking about aliens here. They did that. They were a mess. Read Henrik Ibsen's take on Norwegians 100 years ago. They were a mess. We're a mess. What really changes things for people is going through a transformational process that results in a big change, but yes, it results in change for us as well. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so excited by so many of you being here, because you're all capable of making that kind of choice and saying, I am willing to change in the direction of equality and greater individual freedom and greater degree of community, and shift my identity from that of a consumer to that of a citizen who accepts agency and responsibility for the course of his or her society. And that's what we can all choose to do tonight. You can tell I'm in a church. I'm kind of lurching into sermon a little bit, but there we go, yes. The parliamentary system does give birth to a range of parties, and so a range of points of view are expressed in the national forum. And so, this Tweedledee and Tweedledum 40-yard line to 40-yard line phenomenon, that gets way more interesting when there are more parties. And it makes for a livelier political discourse. So that's an asset they had. On the other hand, you knew there'd be another hand. On the other hand, what I notice is that when a broad social movement is pushing the agenda forward, again, the 60s, we have so much to learn from the leadership of black people in the 60s and the resulting spin-off of a number of other movements that happened. An elders movement called the Gray Panthers, a mental health consumers movement, an education, progressive education movement, the Cesar Chavez United Farm Workers movement, the Brown Berets of Latinos in California. Just multiple movements spun off from the courageous leadership and initiative that was given by black people in the 60s, well, 55 on. And so what we found was that as those movements grow, oh, and by the way, a quick rehearsal of that is just to watch the movie Selma. Just look at Selma on TV. I mean, just get that movie and you'll get a sense of how this moves politics. Because what it does is it puts forward such an urgent, a coercively urgent force into the political arena, such that the political parties we have, which is a disadvantage that we've got the system we have, but those that we do have must respond. And then they do respond. And we retain the agency because we're doing the pushing and they are responding as best they can. And if we keep pushing, which in that era we did, then they respond even more. And if we keep pushing, they respond more. So part of the thing we need to unlearn is the notion that the center of political life is on the legislative and executive level. The center of political life is not on the governmental level. That is not where politics mostly operates in our country. Politics mostly operates on the level of the economic elite telling the politicians what to do. That's one level. And the other level is us pushing from below. That's where the political action is. Now, the media, of course, presents an entirely different point of view. Entirely different point of view. But why on earth should we believe the media's view? Who owns the media? And how, indeed, does the media's portrayal of politics in America support the status quo? So we need to develop, among the many alternatives we need to develop, and that's the same work that the Nordics had to do. They had to keep looking at each thing and saying, oh my gosh, we had that wrong. Oh my gosh, we had that wrong. Oh, we've got it. Oh, we were believing the capitalist myth that it's private enterprise that's more productive, but now we're building these co-ops and we're finding that the co-ops are actually more effective than private enterprise, and now that's empirically demonstrated. The cooperative banks came through 2008 way better than the private banks did. Private banks going out of business right and left in Europe and the US, and the co-op banks were holding steady. Over and over, I give the statistics here of how superior cooperative enterprise is as a generalization to private enterprise. And the Nordics learned that. That was part of actually their revolutionary ferment, was learning the power of co-ops and building housing and doing all kinds of things. But that was a switch in their heads because they had been programmed, just like you say, we've been programmed. They were programmed to think private enterprise is the way to make things happen. Now, where they stopped short of communism, of course, was to say there's value in supporting private entrepreneurship. Because there are people who are talented, just natively talented at developing a new way to create this product, or a new way to get this service done, or a new way to do this, or a new way to do that. And economies will be more productive if they support this thing called entrepreneurship. Just like a society is going to generate a more interesting culture if it supports its artists. I mean, there are these things that just exist right in the population. You can choose to support it or not, but if you support it, you're going to end up with something better. And supporting entrepreneurs is a good idea. So there are more startups in Norway than there are in the US per capita. How about that? Call Norway socialist? Well, you can call it socialist, but they have more startups than we do. And it's because they use their Nordic model to support entrepreneurship. And I have a whole chapter on entrepreneurs.
Just to give some context, I just read that we have 800 military bases around the world, and that doesn't include the secret ones. We're responsible for 54% of the arms deals that happen, and our military spending is bigger than the next 10 combined.
Right. Thank you. So he's giving stats for backing up this proposition or this implication from our questioner that the United States has an empire. You know, one of the things I really enjoyed about the neoconservative fling that the United States had under George W. Bush. Do you remember that neoconservatives were really out of the closet and they were writing profusely, and they were getting the United States into attacking Iraq and that kind of thing. And one of the things that I really loved about them, the only thing I loved about them actually, was that they said the United States has an empire. And they were trying to bring our discourse into reality by trying to get liberals and everybody to just acknowledge the United States has a vast empire, a vast economic and military empire. And I just thought, that is so refreshing. I mean, candid discussion. I mean, can you get liberals to agree that we have an empire? It's very hard to do that, at least inside the Beltway. But there were these neoconservatives who said, okay, you know, cut the crap. We have an empire now. Let's make this empire really work well and make it more effective and more hegemonic than ever and stuff like that. I don't believe that we can do the social democratic model and maintain the empire. I don't think so. I think there's a contradiction between trying to maintain equality and individual freedom and community internally while repressing that reality for other countries. And I think that contradiction would prevent us from getting there. So on the one hand, you could say, well, the empire comes first. On the other hand, who is it who maintains the empire? Politically, it's the 1%, right? They're the people who won that struggle. Do you remember in American history there was actually a struggle in the United States about whether we should have an imperial system? And there was this was leading up to 1900, a vast anti-imperialist movement and a very strong, obviously pro-imperial movement. And those clashed. And by the Spanish-American War, that question had been pretty much settled. The United States will have an empire. And so we've been running empire ever since. But if you look at who was on what side of that, you'll find that it was the economic elite that really, really, really wanted an empire and has made that a priority even at times when it was so disgusting, Vietnam War and so on and so on. However, this is a situation where it's a common opponent. That is, the opponent of the Nordic model is the 1%, but the opponent, if you happen to be anti-empire, is also the 1%, because they are the stratum that most is invested in both of those. And they're the ones who love the Trans-Pacific, right? All of that, NAFTA, all of that. The labor movement opposed. It's class war, that's what's going on. And so in the process of overthrowing the dominance of the economic elite in order to get the Nordic model, we would also be overthrowing the mainstay, the pillar for the US empire. Now that isn't going on in a vacuum in my projection. I want to live long enough to see this happen. Because we in the US who happen to love democracy and therefore hate empire, we are not the only ones who hate empire. How about Latin America? Take a poll. Think of all the people in the world who would go to bed more secure knowing that the US empire was no more. And so it would be an enormous, and those folks are, of course, doing way more to undermine the US empire than Americans are, right? So the loss in Vietnam of the US empire was, yes, I was ready to die. I risked my life in that cause of ending the war, but I was also in personal touch with North Vietnamese and National Liberation Front people and Buddhists, Third, Fourth Buddhists in South Vietnam, and I knew they were doing the major fighting and dying in the struggle against the US empire, and they were the most responsible for defeating the empire. And in the US empire's defeats, ever since then, it's mostly been those people who have carried the battle with some support, and I'm so grateful. For example, with regard to Central America, so much support came from Americans of solidarity kinds of things. So I do think it's part of the same process, and we won't really come to the point where, say, Great Britain was when the Labour Party took the government in the beginning of the 30s, but it still had this enormous empire. I don't think that's real today. Well, one way to reduce violence in a society is to de-stress. Somebody who's lived in Denmark for 10 years. The thing you'll like about the Nordic model, the Nordic theory of everything, is there was a Finnish immigrant came to the U.S., and about half her book is how stressful she found it to live in the U.S. as compared with Finland. The United States is a stress machine. And so it stresses people. It stresses moms, stresses dads, stresses everybody. And it stresses police, right? As police don't do their job well, and one reason is because they're so stressed. It's a stress machine. We have to, and so the Nordic model, one of its accomplishments that is not written about much is that it de-stresses.
And do you think that this leads to an abolition of child abuse, or is it the other way around?
I think there's no question. When you see, you've seen in supermarkets or something, the stressed mom dealing with the baby, you know, the crying child, right? And you, oh my God, oh, that seems so harsh. Or maybe it even involves hitting or screaming or whatever. You're seeing a stressed mom. Yeah. Yeah, the security is a big value in the Nordic countries, right? Are people so stressing over there about their old age? No. Are they stressing about losing their health insurance? No. Are they stressing about, I'm in the wrong job, but I have to stay in this job in order to keep my health insurance? No, because it's universal health insurance. Am I stressing about whether my kids can get into college for payment? No. There's so many. People get a one-page tax return with the government sends you your tax return filled out with a cover note, is this correct? If it's correct, you sign it and send it back in, done. There are so many ways. How many of you have torn your hair out about an aged relative? Like, you know, right? Retirement, home care, where's the money to come from? How do you turn, you know, maybe living with me, but it's driving our family crazy because she leaves the fire on under the tea kettle. You know, you can think of the amount of stress. The kids, what do I do with the kids? The kids are sick, but if I miss one more day of work, bottle feeding, breastfeeding is a right on the part of new mothers. And they have up to 2 hours of paid time per day at work to breastfeed their children. Best place in the world to be a mom. Because why would it help an economy to have moms madly distracted because they're not doing well by their kids?
Where do they keep the baby during the day while they're at work?
In a creche, in the nursery, downstairs or around the corner. So they can go and, they get a phone call. Your baby's crying, probably is it feeding time? I'll be right down. Boom, there they go. Absolutely, no questions asked. No. Different countries have different amounts. They all have an enormous amount of not only paid parental leave that is shared by dad and mom. The dad needs to do parental leave as well as the mom because otherwise it's not gender equality, right? And we're into gender equality in the Nordic system, right? So it's paid parental leave for a long time, and the job is absolutely guaranteed when they come back. So when you look at the multiple times, I know people, I have a son-in-law who's been in jail for a long time, armed robbery, but I know him very, very well. I know what puts him there. I know what motivates him to do what he does. And his family background, the whole deal. It's one word that summarizes his formation and his life is the word stress. And thank you, Michael Moore, for showing what they do with incarceration. It's all about de-stressing. It's all about job training. It's all about therapy. It's about de-traumatizing, because a lot of people are traumatized by the time they get to jail. It's about supporting individuals. When they're ready, they go home for a holiday out of prison and then come back after the Christmas. The family reuniting is supported by social workers. They're trained for jobs that are doable jobs. They're walked to the place of employment if that's what's necessary in order to get them to sit down and fill out the application. And they're installed in jobs, and they have the lowest recidivism rates in Europe. The lowest. Mass incarceration strikes them as an abomination, which it is. They would never put up with that. And do you know what they tell the prisoners after they go through this whole long investment supporting prisoners to rehab and rejoin society and become productive and family people again? They tell the workers, we want you to be a taxpayer. We don't want you to spend the rest of your life. I mean, they don't even keep people in prison for anything like the length of time we do. Because why should they? People should be back in the street earning money and paying taxes. This whole Nordic thing doesn't work unless everybody's a contributing citizen rather than consumer, and they're paying taxes, and that's what makes the ball work. I think when you read the book, you'll see just how many points at which violence flares. And there now have been economists who've tried to estimate the billions of dollars the United States wastes every year through criminality. And how economically stupid it is for us to stress our society in this way and to deprive people in this way such that we get the criminality we do. Also, it's very clear now, the more inequality you have in any society, the more criminality you get. It's absolutely predictable. So, of course, the conclusions are all there. The whole thing is so rational, which is why we need to create mass movements that insist that those who are also operating in a kind of rational way, but on their interests, need to be moved aside so that we can have what is truly rational for an economy, which is an economy that serves the majority of us. And I'm remembering a mentor of mine whose name was Bayard Rustin, and you knew him, who used to say, he was an advisor to Dr. King, and he used to say in the 60s, look, unless we handle the economics that condemn us to this situation, we will have as bad a situation with racism in 50 years as we have now. And he was right. That is to say that the racial discrimination and racism and white supremacy are all bound up in the institutions that make this economy work and also grind us all and also hurt us all. So I was very impressed by the Movement for Black Lives vision that was just issued August 1st, read it right away, and because it was, I think Bayard in his grave would be smiling, because that vision that comes out of the Black Lives Movement and is co-signed by 50 or so organizations involved with the Black Lives Movement around the country is a vision that totally lines up with this. It totally lines up with the Nordic model. That is, it understands that until we have quality public education, for example, for all, and free higher education available to all, and so on, and job training, excellent job training for all, and so on, and jobs for all, because these are full employment economies. And we deliberately have high unemployment economy until if those things are put into place that are already in the vision issued August 1st, you can easily find it on the internet, then what we actually would end up with is the Nordic model. That is what is being proposed essentially by the Movement for Black Lives. And for me, that was great excitement because it provides a platform being initiated from the movement that is, I think, the most dramatic social movement going on today, the Movement for Black Lives, is taking the initiative to offer a vision to all people that would benefit all people. And I do mean all people, because I think the economic elite would also benefit from living in a society that was fair, that supported individual freedom, that supported equality of all kinds, racial equality, gender equality, all the equality. And I think that they would also do better as well. And that's one reason why I put in my chapter interviews with entrepreneurs, people who make many millions of dollars, who say, I would prefer to live in Norway because this is a really decent country and this is a country which I would like to be. That is the kind of country. I made friends with an African from Burundi who was a fairly recent immigrant to Norway. I wanted to know his personal story. What is it like as a very dark-skinned black man in a country that's still, mostly blue-eyed, right, and very fair-skinned. Although it's become like 1 in 6 Norwegians is now foreign-born. So those countries are rapidly diversifying. They're not anything like as homogeneous as they were. But anyway, I tell this Michael's story in this book also about his experience of being invited into a society, invited into an economy where there's a genuine level playing field, and how well he's been able to adjust into that situation despite not only the color of his skin, but coming from a very, very different country, right? Burundi, very, very different country, very different cultural background, and a different language that he grew up with. And he was able to make a terrific adjustment because it's a genuinely level playing field that's offered there. On the other hand, because this is the last question, I will say that I have a couple of chapters here at the end where I talk about areas of struggle still for the Nordics. And one of those struggles is racism, because I don't want to pretend that there's not racism there. There's enormous and dramatic acting out of racism in this country, but there still is racism in those countries as well. And so I tell in that chapter both how that racism does show up, how it puts some people at disadvantage, and also what they're doing to work the Nordic model to eliminate racism. And then the other chapter where they're struggling and we're struggling is also climate, the climate crisis, which of course, will hurt us all, but will hurt the most vulnerable the most if it's not resolved. And they are light years ahead of the United States with regard to addressing the climate crisis, but they still haven't gotten to where they need to go. And there's a big debate going on in those countries about that right now. So I'm not presenting a utopian picture. I'm afraid up till now it may seem like I was. I don't want to be a total booster, because actually I have friends who are radicals in those countries who can tell you a lot of stuff that's wrong with those countries. And if I were there, I tell these radical friends who say, George, we're going to dislike this book because this book is going to come across like, oh, the wonderful paradise and stuff like that. And I say, look, if I were a Swedish radical, I would be as radical as you are, with regard to, and Sweden ought to change this, and it ought to change that, and it ought to change the other thing. Or Denmark too, right? But I am addressing this book to Americans, and from an American point of view, not only would race relations get way easier if we had the Nordic model, but gender relations, all of the things that so vex us, including violence, including militarism, would get easier to handle in that context. That's my belief. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be signing books back there, and happy to engage you more as I do so. Thank you, Charles.
George, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think we'd all agree. Thank you so much, George.
We really think this spells the end of consumerism. Now, consumerism was an engineered trend, right? During the course of the 20th century, we had a real economic problem on our hands, which was the problem of overproduction. With cheap fossil fuels, we could make so many consumer products so fast in such large quantities that there was the danger of just overwhelming markets. And that's one of the things that led to the Great Depression. So with the help of advertising and consumer credit, we engineered a whole new kind of economy, the consumer economy, where instead of citizens, we became dutiful consumers. And it was our duty to go out and buy stuff so as to create jobs, so as to keep the economy moving. And, you know, if the World Trade Center is attacked and buildings fall, what are we asked to do as citizens? Go out and buy stuff. Do your job as a consumer. Well, we are moving into a different kind of economy, the end of the consumer economy and the dawn of the conserver economy.